Hello and welcome back to CHY4U, History of the West and the World at Discovery Academy. My name is Arsenio Kirchhofer, and today we're going to continue by exploring the state of European society on the eve of modernity. Last time we looked at feudalism, Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church. Today I want to take a look at society, literature and art, technology and trade between Europeans and non-European people. So what was European society like? Well, if we traveled back in past, we would find that the way people lived was very different from the way we live today. It's, I'm not talking about just the obvious differences like cell phones and cars. I'm also talking about more subtle differences. For example, people in Middle Ages did not sleep the way we sleep. For example, they didn't sleep lying down. They slept sitting up. Another way they differed in sleeping was, for example, they would get up traditionally at around midnight or 1 in the morning for Mass, stay up for 2 hours, then go back to sleep, only to wake up later again. So they would, for example, break up their sleep cycles. So those are subtle differences, but the past is a different country. It is as if we traveled into a completely different society. European society at the time, throughout most of the Middle Ages, was superstitious and devout. Superstitious meaning they believed in angels and demons, they believed in fairies, they believed in evil spirits. They had many superstitions, some of which are still around today. For example, 13 as an unlucky number, or a black cat as a bad omen. Those are the kinds of superstitions, but they were even much more so. And devout means that they were intensely religious. And in fact, much of everyday life was centered around religion. Attending church, uh, certainly once a week at least, was ordinary, and the institution of the church and your local church were really the centers of the community. The way families worked were also quite different. Most marriages, even among lower class people, were arranged, and all marriages in the upper classes were certainly arranged. For example, the poorer, the lower classes tended to marry late, and they usually had large family, typically 6 to 10 children. Only one or two, however, survived to adulthood. However, there's a common myth that, oh, well, most people in Europe only lived until 30. That is not actually true. Once you manage to survive past childhood, you are likely to live almost as long as people live today. So actually, most people who manage to live to adulthood, unless they were killed or in wars, would tend to die still in their 60s, sometimes even 70s. Upper classes, on the other hand, tended to marry early, and they tended to have small immediate families. You didn't want a lot of children. Uh, if you were a noble, if you were a noble person, if you were in upper classes, because that meant dividing your inheritance into several chunks. However, because upper classes uh, married other upper classes, you would often have dozens, hundreds even of relatives spread over a wide area. Also, another big difference was that most people did not travel very far. And from what we know from church records, diaries, and other sources, was that most people rarely traveled further than 20 miles away from their birthplace. So think about it. We're used to going on vacation to other continents. We're used to moving to other countries, sometimes more than once in our lifetime, to for work, relationships, and whatnot. In those days, that was not the option. Typically, you were born in a village or a town, and you would live out your whole life, either there in the same house you were born in or somewhere nearby. Another big difference was how things were produced, how food was produced. all food had to be grown locally. You couldn't transport food very far. Food spoiled. They didn't have refrigeration. They didn't have pasteurization. That meant that whatever you ate, you either grew yourself or was grown nearby. So there was not a great variety of food available to you. And also because machinery was not yet developed, or at least not as developed as it is today, most tools, whether weapons, shovels, hammers, but also things like your clothing, your shoes, hat, uh, all of that had to be produced locally, and it was produced by hand. That meant that even something like a shirt became a treasured possession because to make one shirt meant a great deal of effort. To make a tool could mean a great deal of effort. People cherished their items, they cherished their belongings because they were expensive and few between. But that doesn't mean that Europeans were entirely isolated. Most people didn't travel further than 20 miles away, but some people traveled halfway around the world. There always were and are entrepreneurs, innovators, explorers, and Middle Ages was no different. For example, Marco Polo, depicted here in the upper picture, traveled to China in the 13th century, traveling across half a world by foot, on horseback, on camelback, by ship. He traveled to China in search of treasure and trade. And he helped inspire other explorers because he came back from China and he would claim that roofs in China were plated with gold, that everyone was incredibly rich, and there were many exotic animals and so on, which was true to an extent, but he over exaggerated. That is just one example of how far European merchants and explorers were willing to go. But at the same time, Europeans also traded with the Muslim world, the immediate neighbors of Europe to the east, to the southeast. They traded with Central Asia, with we we the historians, the archaeologists, uh, we find European coins as far away as Afghanistan, for example. So clearly there was a lot of trade going on with very faraway places. Slavic principalities, what we might today call Eastern Europe, Poland, Russia, the Balkans. India was an incredibly important destination for Europeans because of Indian spices, and we'll get into that later. Another thing that helped get trade started up in Europe to get the economy rolling and to encourage more people to travel and trade was salt. And salt was incredibly important in Europe because it's a preservative. The only way you could try to preserve food for later was by salting it. They haven't yet invented cans and canning. They haven't yet invented jams because jams require a lot of sugar, which Europeans did not have. So really the only way to preserve food was salt, which meant that those people who lived near the sea would create salt and then would sell it to people who lived inland. And between the salt trade and the trade with Muslim world, Central Asia, India, China, you start to see curious process where, especially in the Mediterranean, in Italy, you start to see these independent, powerful, and wealthy city-states. So it would be a single city which would control some geographic area around it, but its main source of wealth and power would be trade. So we're talking about cities such as Pisa, Genoa, Venice, Amalfi, Milan, and others. In Northern Europe, we start to see something similar happen because of the salt trade. well as fish trade. So we start to see cities such as Amsterdam and The Hague. Bruges becomes very important because of its clothing, because of its cloth trade. It's where a lot of fine cloth was made. So yes, it was a very static world society in many ways, but there were still many changes. There were still many opportunities for people to explore and get rich and try to improve their lives. Literature and art in Europe during this time was also quite a bit different. First of all, most of it was religious. There was no such thing as a novel, for example. That is a much later creation. There was no such thing as a short story. Most literature, in fact, was either philosophical or it was poetic. And most of it had to do with religious themes. However, we start to see, especially from 12th century onward, we start to see non-religious literature begin to appear. So, for example, epic poems such as the Chanson de Roland or Le Mort d'Arthur, but also romantic poetry begins to appear. Visual art was a little bit slower to change. Uh, it was still mostly either religious, so here we have, for example, statues depicting famous saints, or it was, I'm just going to go back a couple of slides, or it was historical in nature. So, for example, over here, this is what's called the Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the conquest of England by Duke William of Normandy. In Middle Ages, we also start to see improvements and innovations in architecture. So you start to see uh, what's called the Gothic style slowly develop. You can see here in this beautiful Gothic church in Germany. So really, really high ceilings, stained glass windows, a lot of arches, tremendously beautiful and awe-inspiring. And its purpose was to impress just how powerful the church and God were. But for example, cloths, you would have might be surprised if you travel back in time to find out that people, at least the rich people in Europe at the time, were much more colorful than is the norm today. They valued clothing dyes from Muslim world, and bright clothes were a symbol of power, wealth, and status. So the wealthier you were, the more brighter your clothes were, and the clothes became more and more ornate, so they became more and more complex. And as far as literature goes, by late Middle Ages, Europeans also become more and more interested in what other people, non-European people, know. So they become more interested in literature and writings of either ancient cultures, Romans and Greeks, and Muslims. So there is also an exchange of ideas. And speaking of ideas, technology, most people tend to think of Middle Ages as being very backwards, very primitive. Nothing can be further from the truth. In fact, technology during this period becomes more and more advanced, and we start to see a lot of progress that Europeans are either coming up with on their own or adopting from other cultures. So, just as an example, during the period of Middle Ages, from roughly 11th to 14th century, Europeans invent the Gothic arch, which makes these enormous cathedrals and beautiful buildings possible. The Great Plough, which improves how much food can be grown on land. Three-field agriculture, which allows land to be used more efficiently. They invent the longbow as a powerful ranged weapon. They invent complex, well, actually, they borrow slash invent lateen sails, so it's more complicated sails for ships, so the ship can sail further and further away from land. They invent stained glass. This is, for example, an example of European stained glass. They invent spectacles, glasses for correcting vision, better wells. From other countries, Europeans also acquire knowledge or at least awareness of gunpowder, which originally comes from China, and the Europeans may have heard of it and possibly reinvented it. Certainly, we'll talk about that later on. From the Muslims, the Europeans acquire the compass and the astrolabe. These are the tools of navigation. Without them, you cannot navigate at sea. Without those tools, Europeans would never have been able to cross the Atlantic Ocean and discover America. They acquire new maps, silk. From the Muslim world and India, Europeans acquire mathematics and geometry. So, for example, here we have geometric theorems being shown in a stained glass window. Algebra is originally an Arabic word because Europeans learned of it from the Arabs. At the same time, Europe is constantly undergoing war. It's a period of one war after another, and so better and better weapons have to be made. And if the enemy has better and better weapons, well, you keep coming up with better and better armor. So we start to see what's called the Gothic plate or full plate. So very what we tend to think of as knights in shining armor, right? Siege weapons. So you need ways to knock down the castle walls so you can get at your enemy. Gunpowder, tactics, and strategy, all of this improves. Yes, it's very violent. Yes, not all of it is positive, but there is technological progress. Slowly but surely, things are speeding up. The rate at which uh, human technology improves is getting faster. Next lecture, we're going to take a look at a few of the dramatic events from late Middle Ages that helped bring about the Renaissance.